Hi, and welcome to Living and Learning. Today our episode is about the Internet of Things. Now, what does that really mean, Internet of Things? Okay, it means really why we're so incessantly connected to things like this and things like this, all right, my computer here, and how we can't seem to get away with them. As pathetic as it seems, I realized, I was thinking about this episode today with our guest, who I'm going to announce and introduce in just a second, how when I go to bed at night, how sad is this? This is the last thing I see, and it's the first thing I see in the morning because I use it as my alarm clock, right? So that, my water and my glasses, it's become my life, right? So anyway, we're here to talk about the internet, generally speaking, and the Internet of Things a little bit more specifically about connectivity and how we can't seem to get away from it. Today, I am very pleased to have as my guest Jeff Kaplan, who is Managing Director of THINKstrategies. Jeff is one of the leading, perhaps definitely in the country, if not the world, leading experts on the information technology industry, and has worked many years in this business. And so he's here to give us some insights onto the internet. His expertise probably has more to do with the business world, so we might focus a little bit more on that. So I'm going to talk about what's happening now, what's going to happen in the future, and what you need to know about that could be helpful in your life as either a business person, if you're in academia, or if you're a student thinking about careers and how to plan a good job focus for yourself in the future. So with that, let me introduce you to Jeff. And so I'm going to start with the question, what is, or how do we start with this thing called the internet?
Well, Karen, since we're starting with such a small idea.
Right. A small concept.
Yeah. So, the internet has been here for a long time.
Right.
It's gotten more attention over the past decade or so, but it was really created, if you will, back in the 60s, and maybe to some people's minds earlier than that, as the computer age began to dawn. And the idea of the internet was to connect computers together from remote places.
Right.
In fact, to do it in such a way that the military could take advantage of it, academia could take advantage of it, and various companies in between could take advantage of it. And the idea was to bring together a network of computers that allowed each of those computers and the people behind them to be able to gather information, to be able to collate that information, be able to analyze that information, and be able to benefit from that information in a variety of ways.
Right.
What happened over the past 20 years or so is that the internet became a public utility, if you will.
Right.
Because of the browser, because of deregulation, because of technological advancements, the convergence of all of these factors, it was made available for commercial purposes and public access in ways that were originally intended to, again, exploit the ability to share that information across even a broader audience, but also now, as we know, to use it for a variety of other purposes.
Right.
We could spend a lot of time talking
about the other purposes, yeah. So I think what I'd like to do is segue into, now that we've introduced the topic, I'd like to talk a little bit about, as Jeff was talking about the regulations and the companies and the sharing and all of that, he has a vast experience in this market and is a tracker of the industry. And in full transparency, I will tell you that I have come to know Jeff when we were colleagues at International Data Corporation. I was an analyst tracking the software and services industry, and Jeff was tracking the telecom market.
That's right.
They drove me out because of all the nasty things I said about IBM. No, I'm just kidding about that.
No.
But anyway, but he's the darling of the industry, and he has stayed with it and gained even more expertise. So I'm going to have him talk a little bit about, for the people who want to know, how do you get into this business in the first place? How do you become a renowned expert? How did you get into the information technology industry?
Well, partially it was by accident.
Okay. I didn't know that.
I'll admit that. My original goal in life was to change the world. I'm
a small goal.
I'm a child of the 60s. I went
Yeah.
to school in the 70s. I don't want to date us, but
Don't give the graduation date. We don't do that anymore.
We both evolved around the same time. I came out of school during a period of time when there was a lot of disruption socially going on and politically going on, and I wanted to be a part of all of that, and got involved in some nonprofit endeavors, we'll call them.
Yeah.
And then I saw
I didn't know that.
before we met,
Yeah.
and before I came to Boston, I was in the New Haven, Connecticut area where I grew up, and I really wanted to change the world. Now, the political climate changed when Ronald Reagan came into office, and I kind of looked around and said, this nonprofit thing may not be a long-term career opportunity.
This is true. He was cutting back on the basic science research. And by the way, Jeff and I are both undergraduates from Rutgers University,
right.
But we didn't know each other on campus. The campus is so huge, right? We didn't even know each other.
I think we were right around the corner and didn't even
know. Yeah.
So what happened was I decided to go back and get my MBA.
Yeah.
And I got my
At
MBA
BC,
at
right?
Boston College.
Yeah.
There was good Boston College colors on today, by the way. Thanks.
That's
I
right.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
A little bit of Rutgers there as well.
There you go. I try to cover all the bases. And a little Harvard, too, actually.
And what's interesting is that sometimes opportunities cross your path. You're not even aware of them. But sometimes you see something that does catch your attention, and it can really have a big impact on you. So I went to Boston College, sort of dropped out of the nonprofit world, went back to school, and was getting my MBA. And I thought I was going to go back into kind of a nonprofit job opportunity. But one day I was in the library, and I saw a magazine up on the wall called Data Communications Magazine. And the headline of that magazine was AT&T divestiture to disrupt the telecom industry. Now, I didn't know anything about data communications. I only knew AT&T was the phone company, but I saw that word disruption.
Yeah.
And I saw this bigger idea of telecommunications. I opened up this magazine, and I started reading, and I was fascinated by what was about to go on. And this was 1983 when the AT&T monopoly was being pulled apart.
Can I interrupt for 1
Go
second?
ahead. Yeah.
Disrupt for 1 second.
Yes,
I want to disrupt
sure.
for 1 second. What did you major in business school? What was your focus?
Marketing and strategy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Because I wasn't good at numbers, and I wasn't going to do ops. I still like the kind of creative aspects of marketing and strategy. And I read this article, and a company called IDC, International Data Corporation, was mentioned in there. And I had learned from my previous experience working in the nonprofit sector. I worked for United Way, where we did a lot of fundraising.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay, sure.
And you learn how to pick up the phone and ask for money, basically.
That's right.
So I picked up the phone and called the guy at IDC who I saw mentioned in this article. And I got him on the phone.
That took a lot of initiative, actually.
Yeah. Well, back then people even answered their own phones.
This is true. This is definitely true.
And I called him up and I said, hey, I was just reading this article and I'm fascinated about what you're doing. And I'm a MBA student over at Boston College. I'm about to graduate. This is like in April, May, and graduation was going to be May, June. And I said, I'd like to learn more about this, and I was wondering if I could talk to you. And he said to me, he paused for a moment, and he said, well, it's interesting because I just got a rec for a new job opening, and if you want to come by the next day or so, if I like you, I might hire you.
Wow.
That's
exciting.
Next thing you know, I'm getting hired for a job in an industry I didn't really know anything about.
Right.
It was that initiative that had impressed him.
Yeah, sure.
And my interest, which had impressed him. And as you know, because we did spend a few years together at IDC, that telecom program, which I became a part of, really took off because the industry was going through a lot of changes. Excuse me. And what I discovered was that despite the fact I didn't know anything about the technology, I don't know the difference between a bit or a byte.
Right.
It was all magic to me.
But you got eventually.
You learn enough.
Yeah.
You fake it enough.
Enough
you learn
to be
enough.
dangerous. Yeah.
You learn enough to be dangerous, but more importantly, you learn what you are good at. And
Right.
what I did understand was,
that's really useful. Yeah.
was
Tell us about that.
the political landscape, so to speak, the human dynamic of how people were being impacted by the changes in their lives in the telecom industry, the competitive impact in terms of how the players were changing, the marketing impact there, and the business impact there.
Right. Well, there's a little chessboard type thing going on.
Yeah, and I also discovered I like being a part of a business where we were actually competing with other companies in the
That's
same
true.
sector. There were companies back then like DataQuest and others. And there was I've discovered a kind of competitiveness in myself.
Right.
And all of that led me to really enjoy this experience. And by the way, as you remember, we had clients who were desperately looking for help and advice.
Absolutely.
So in a sense, I was using my social services skills in a different sector. I was still helping people survive in a disrupted world. It was, a telecommunications world. So what I discovered was I was good at services, telecommunications services. And as you mentioned in your intro, I gravitated from there into information technology services. Not dwelling on the computers and how they work, but dwelling on the services that deliver that functionality. Lo and behold, in the 90s, this thing called the internet emerges. And again, trying to stay a step ahead of the posse, so to speak, and see the new trend. I saw the opportunities and the potential and the disruptive capabilities of the internet, and joined a young company that was actually based on the West Coast and became their director of strategic marketing, helping them to promote their capabilities in the industry, capitalizing on the internet. And using my experiences, using my relationships, and using my sense of perspective about what was going on in the marketplace to help them grow. So eventually we became recognized by another market research firm. You remember Yankee Group here in Boston. They named us the #1 consulting company in 1998, I believe it was, ahead of companies like Anderson Consulting back then. It was Accenture yet. IBM Consulting.
Accenture it's called now, right?
Accenture
ACCENTURE,
And we were named the most prominent consulting group, even though we were a fraction of the size. And in part, and here's another little lesson along the way, it's all about who you know. The founder and CEO of Yankee Group, who was this, a pretty prominent guy named Howard Anderson, his name you may remember.
Yeah, absolutely.
Howard was a pretty flamboyant guy, we'll say. He really helped to have an impact on the industry. And I happened to bump into him on a street corner at a major conference in Washington, D.C. that year. And I had gotten abused by my boss the year before because our company had not even shown up on his top 10 list, on Howard's top 10 ranking of consulting companies. So I bumped into Howard by accident, but I took advantage of the opportunity. I said, Howard, we're doing pretty well with this company. I hope that you'll recognize us in the next list. Just sort of kidding. Well,
you have to poke him a little bit.
You got to take advantage of your opportunities. And the next thing I know, about a week or two later, my boss is calling me from the West Coast saying, I don't know what you said to Howard, but whatever it is, it worked. And he had put us at the top of the list.
Wow.
Now, when I contacted them afterwards,
so what kind of a lunch did you buy for this guy?
Let's put it this way: I didn't buy anything for him beforehand, but afterwards, he got a nice bottle of wine.
Yeah, well, he must have seen the research. You drew his attention to it.
And he did admit that it was based more on research than personal relationships. But I'm sure being reminded didn't hurt.
Absolutely.
And that was another lesson learned, which is that as we've discovered. You can never have too many friends. And maintaining relationships has a lot to do with surviving in a very disruptive world. So out of that experience, just one more piece in the puzzle here, our company, as a result of that ranking, was acquired by a prominent telecommunications company called Lucent Technologies.
Oh, yes. Okay.
And Lucent Technologies bought us for 13 times revenues, unheard of.
Wow.
And that was the good news. That was the good news. The bad news was about 6 months later, they missed their numbers in their quarterly report, and they went down, and we went down, and I ended up leaving the company and starting my own firm. totally without any plan. Because
And that was THINKstrategies.
That was
Right, okay.
THINKstrategies.
Yeah.
So THINKstrategies was born on a Friday morning when I walked into a startup that I had become a part of about 45 days after 9/11. And this startup was part of the collateral damage
Yeah.
at that time, the dotcom bust, and
Right.
everything that was happening with
That's right.
9/11.
Could you just stop you for a second there for some of the audience that may not understand what we mean by the dot-com
Yes.
era and the dot-com bust? If you
Yes.
can talk a little bit about that.
So getting back to the internet, through the 90s, there was a surge of activity around this new internet idea.
Right.
Everybody was building websites. Everybody was thinking about the potential to sell their products and services through the web.
Right.
The technology was still pretty primitive.
Right.
The marketing and strategy ideas are still pretty
Primitive. Yeah.
immature.
In fact, let me just also point out, because today social media is just ubiquitous too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, obviously it relies on the internet, but back then it was fairly nascent
Yes.
as an industry or in a way of marketing
Yes.
your product. So
Yes.
now,
So
back to you, Jeff.
to that point,
Yeah.
everybody was throwing themselves at that door, so to speak, trying to figure out how to be successful in the internet with this new idea of e-commerce. We had things like pets.com and other kinds
Right.
of crazy ideas
Yeah.
that were born then. And there was a lot of money that was coming through from the venture capital world because the overall economy was pretty good. And a lot of companies were born and not too many companies succeeded. And
Right.
what happened, actually, to be precise about it, was this company Lucent I mentioned before was the first of the telecom companies, the big established companies, to hit a speed bump. And then people discovered that there was some shenanigans going on between various telecommunications companies.
oh really? Oh, I
So
didn't know
companies
that.
like
That's right.
MCI and others, they were kind of playing around with
Oh,
the way in
yeah.
which they reported their revenues. So many of them began to tumble, and the monies that were being generated by the bigger companies started to dry up among the smaller companies. So many of the startups failed, and that's what they refer to as the dot-com bust.
I
So
see.
that first generation of web-based companies that failed.
Yeah.
I was a part of that group with a company that was founded and funded by Fidelity Investments, as a matter of fact. And they
Well, they survived.
survived
They
nicely.
survived.
Yeah, I've survived
That's
all
because of the
right.
banking part.
So most
Yeah.
venture firms survive okay.
Yeah.
Because they know when to pull the plug out of the
Exactly,
companies that they're
right.
supporting.
Yeah.
And what happened was they came in on a Friday morning unannounced and they said, hey guys, it's been nice, but we're pulling the plug.
Wow.
So I called up my wife, who you happen to know, and I said, let's have coffee. And she looked at me and said, okay, so what's going on? And I told her about the situation. We were looking at the overall climate with 9/11 and everything else. And she said, well, it doesn't look like there are going to be a lot of job opportunities out there. What are you going to do? I said, well, maybe I should start my own thing.
Yeah.
So what's the premise? And I said, well, I've always been focused on services.
Right.
And the technology world has always been, fixated on the features and functions of the technology. Maybe I can kind of differentiate myself and say, hey, the world's going to move from products to services.
Right.
And at some point, the internet.
Which is really true.
And-
Which did happen.
It did.
Clearly.
And
Yeah.
the internet powered that.
Right.
So she said, well, you're going to call yourself Jeff Kaplan and Associates, or what are you going to be? I
Right.
said, well, I don't want to be Jeff Kaplan and Associates. How about if we come up with a name? And I always liked the IBM Think.
Yes.
What is it? The iconic term.
Right.
There's a
right.
term for that.
At that time, in particular, that
Yes,
was what they
were a
really
very
used a
prominent
lot.
company.
Yes.
Very prominent
absolutely.
company. They come out of the ashes
Yeah.
themselves to reestablish themselves. So I went home and I said,
Of course,
okay,
they did get some competition from Apple.
Yes.
There's a little bit there.
yes,
yeah.
yes, we helped to bring it back into attention. So I looked at Think This, Think That, and found THINKstrategies.com was available.
No, great
And I
name
grabbed
actually.
it,
Yeah.
And I trademarked it, and I
Yeah.
got the whatever other things you needed to have back
Right,
then.
right, to establish your business, yeah.
And then used my my Rolodex of 200 names, and I sent
Right.
out a message to
Right.
my 200 friends.
Wow.
And one of the messages hit a friend who that day, who was working at one of the market research firms, had a client who was looking for some insights on this topic.
Right.
And she didn't know how to answer the question, so she referred him to me.
Right.
That was the first week I was
Interesting.
in business.
So there you
And
go.
all of a sudden I had
That's right.
business. And over 15, 16, almost 17 years now, that's the way it's worked.
That's the way it's
People, helping people, so
Right.
to speak.
Right.
So-
Right. I wanted to say one thing. When Jeff was talking about how, well, I wasn't really good at numbers. Just so you know, when you are in this business, because essentially, as you started, you were a market analyst, and International Data Corporation was a market research and consulting firm.
Yes.
You do actually work a lot with numbers and
yes.
spreadsheets and market trends. Yes, you need to study the market, you need to know the players, as we were describing the chessboard aspect of it. But it does help to be really well-rounded, but that's not all there is.
Yeah.
So,
But it also helps to be able to sort of roll with the punches, if you will. I'm not sure if it's the right way to express it, but
Yeah.
when you and I first started, we had calculators that looked like that thing
that's
there.
true.
And
That's
then
true.
the
Yeah.
spreadsheet actually arrived when we were at
That's true.
IDC.
Yeah.
It was Lotus.
Right.
And
Lotus
it was,
Development, the Cambridge
Right.
company at the time.
and
that
a couple of
developed
couple
yeah.
others, and we had to go to classes to figure out how to
Right.
do tabs
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you figure that stuff out.
Right.
When I started my business, I didn't know anything about throwing a website together.
Right.
I didn't know anything really about marketing my capabilities.
Yes.
You kind of learn that as you go along,
Right.
and you ask a lot of questions of a lot
Right.
of friends who can help you out along
Yeah.
the way.
Yeah.
So,
So I would say to add to this is that just like it is today, anybody, not just young students looking for a job or what to do for their career, but really everyone, and the whole purpose of even this show, Lifelong, is focused on lifelong learning, is that really is the attitude that you have to have. With the disruption in the market, with the way that things change so rapidly. And I'd like to say, some people would argue with me that they'll say, oh, it's no different than the Industrial Revolution. I think it is. I think that the rate of change now and what we're predicting for the future is going to be even more rapid. So the idea of being nimble, being curious, really trying to look ahead, because someone like Jeff you don't get to be a leader in your industry by just keeping pace. You have to, okay, what's the next thing coming down? Or what am I see happening in the market? Really keeping your pulse on who the players are, what are the trends in the market. And I guess I would say, if you have to say, and the name of the book escapes me, but the point about what's actually happening and making a lot of these changes that we're seeing would be definitely technology, globalization, and then there's climate change as the three pillars, if you will, of things that are really, in a sense, wreaking havoc or opportunity, if you want to call it that,
you may be
in the
referring
market.
to Friedman. Is it Friedman's book you're referring to?
I think it is. Yeah, I couldn't remember the exact.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll put it in the credits in case
There you
somebody's interested in reading it. That these things have caused so much in the way of changes, of opportunities, as you talked about the dotcom industry, going by the wayside, that you really do need to stay nimble. So, and that's what Jeff has really done in terms of not necessarily doing all the spreadsheets back in those days, but really advising companies about where the next opportunities are. Or maybe they should divest this, or maybe they should be looking at this kind of opportunity. So, all right, now I'm going to let you take the stage, talk about internet, where it is right now, and what you think we need to be aware of in the future.
So, getting back to the story about THINKstrategies, because
Yeah.
it parallels that evolution and where we are today. When I started THINKstrategies, I was simply thinking about IT products versus IT services. The internet had stumbled. We weren't quite sure where it was going to go. I didn't want to call myself tech strategies
Right.
because I wasn't sure where the tech industry was
Right,
going to
right.
go. But,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it had a bit of a resurgence, and we started hearing ideas about utility computing, about application services, and those evolved into things like software as a service and cloud computing.
Right.
Now, it was
That's a big thing.
Yeah, it's a
the
big thing.
cloud computing. And
And-
there's so many people are really not clear on what that is. What is the cloud? Is it the internet? Well, I'm going to let you talk about that.
Yes. The
Yes.
short answer is yes.
Yes, okay.
Because coincidentally, maybe ironically, back in the old telecom days, back in the 80s and early 90s in particular, if you asked a telecom person, how does the telecommunications network work?
Right.
They would have taken a couple of houses or buildings on a whiteboard, drawn a couple of lines to a cloud. And said, well, up there, it
Right,
all
up
comes
there,
together.
yeah.
Well, the same thing in a sense is true with the internet. The internet is all about pulling together basically remote devices, whether they be large mainframes or small mobile devices, and being able to pull them into a common network connected to common data centers where information flows, basically.
Right.
So this idea of the cloud had a couple of consequences. The first consequence was the idea that any of us could access computing power and actually store our data in this common resource called the cloud.
Right.
And companies like Google, materialize, companies
Right.
like Microsoft.
You've heard of them.
Yeah, little companies like Google. And IBM got involved in that, and
Right.
other companies more recently, like Microsoft, have acknowledged the existence of the cloud and
Right.
jumped in, and Amazon has capitalized on it
Absolutely,
with
yeah.
e-commerce. So there's this common resource.
Right.
It's also a different way of thinking about your business, because companies who previously had sold packaged software
Right.
in a box
Right.
now had to think about how they were actually going to deliver that software functionality online,
Right.
and how they were going to develop it, how are they going to package it, how are they
Right.
going to price it, how are they going
Right.
to sell it, and how are they going to support it.
Right.
The good news is that for the past 15 or so years, there haven't been a lot of people who understood that, and I've tried to capitalize on that from a consulting point of view. And now what's happened is there's more and more competition there, and we have that disruptive force again.
Right.
So
And that's what you've been helping
that-
people.
trying to respond
That
to this.
whole line of things. Like, to me, one of the interesting examples is what happens with inventory control.
Yes.
That's a perfect example of where it used to be the case that you would have to call, I'm just using Staples as an example, but you would have to call them and find out, well, do you have this available, that available? Now you can go online and they'll even tell you, yes, this is in stock, and you can go and look for this information yourself. So on the one hand, it produces opportunities for companies who sell the software to access this kind of information, and other smaller companies. On the other hand, if you were the middle market person who controlled that information, maybe now you don't have a job anymore.
Right.
So that kind of flux is the kind of work, I would say, that Jeff and companies like his gets involved in terms of, how do you survive this and how do you take advantage of these opportunities?
A similar story just
Yeah.
popped up in today's newspaper. Amazon has made it known that it is expanding its e-commerce services into the industrial supply chain.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
And we all know what's happened in terms of consumer retail,
Right.
And we're wondering how they're going to impact the grocery business
Right,
with the
right,
acquisition
with
of
Whole Foods.
Whole Foods.
Yeah.
But they just made people aware that they're now going after the industrial supply chain. So to your point, if I was in the plumbing supply business,
Right.
and I had warehouses all over the country and people on trucks delivering this stuff, I've got to be very concerned about how Amazon
Absolutely.
is going to disrupt my business.
Yeah.
And if I'm an employee of those companies,
Yeah.
I have to be thinking about how is it going to affect my job. And these are the kinds of things that unfortunately we're all contending with.
Right.
Because the good news is that technology makes our lives easier.
Right.
The bad news is that technology can touch our lives in negative ways in terms of job security and other things that,
Right.
that are very sad and scary.
Right, very sad and scary. That's very true. And the key is to stay ahead of it and to figure out where the opportunities are. So we have just a few minutes left, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about what you see coming down the pike in the future and leave us with, some takeaway, some one thing that we really need to think about as we think about the Internet of Things.
All right. So the first thing is, unfortunately, the horse has left the barn, or whatever
Yeah.
the cliche is, and there's no turning back. Right.
Right, absolutely.
So this thing, the Internet, the idea of the Internet of Things, in which everything is going to be connected to the Internet, these are ideas, these are technologies, these are realities that are not going away. there are old world technologies, or I should say old world products and services that are going to be affected, and they're never going to be the same.
Right. We don't use kerosene and stage horses, stagecoaches anymore.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
So we saw the impact, the car had on the buggy. We're now going to see the impact the driverless car is going to have on drivers of all sorts. All these things are going to continue to accelerate, as you mentioned. So the key for all of us is to understand where our unique skills can fit in the brave new world.
Right.
And that means a couple things. The good news is the internet gives us unlimited access to information.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it gives us
education on the internet. Absolutely.
Yeah. So and the education industry is changing itself. A lot of things going online. And so the good news is you can find information. Yeah. The good news also is my ability to contact somebody is even easier today because of LinkedIn and Facebook and other kinds of...
The whole social media realm. Yeah, building community actually can help.
Yeah, and a lot of people are willing to respond to folks if they're approaching the right way for help and advice about these kinds of things. And as I've said to my three sons, you can never have too many friends. And talking to your friends, staying in touch with your friends, asking for help and advice from your friends is what's going to become more and more essential for all of us to survive in this very scary and disruptive world.
Yeah, absolutely.
The good news, though, is that with all those challenges, there's also an unlimited number of opportunities. Things that didn't exist a year or two ago are now full-fledged business opportunities. Yes. Whether you're talking about artificial intelligence or other kinds of things. And artificial intelligence has been talked about for decades, and now is becoming a reality. So there are wonderful things to capitalize on, wonderful ways to create your own business opportunities. But there are a lot of challenges that go along with that. And the key is to read a lot, talk a lot, and work a lot at understanding how you fit into that mosaic.
So would that be your last message? The overall, staying ahead of the curve.
Yeah, as I like to say, stay one step ahead of the posse.
Yeah, there you go. That's right. That's great. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for that insight into the internet, the information technology industry, the Internet of Things, and what it's like to be an analyst in this industry, and the kind of purview that you need to have over not just what's happening in your town or your city or your state, but really globally as we see these things really affecting our world. So hopefully you'll come back again in another, 5 years. Everything will change again, right? The 5-year plan. Now they're probably 3-month plans. Yeah. But in any case, I want to thank you so much for being our guest today. And I hope that you all learned something from this. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us. Bye.